Jesus has some really concerning things to say about the rich throughout the Gospels. We might think, for example, of his saying that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Or we might think about the woes that are paired with the Beatitudes in Luke's Gospel. Woe to the rich, for they have already received their comfort. Or we might think about the Gospel passage from a couple weeks ago about the man with the abundant harvest who said, "Great, now I can be comfortable for the rest of my life. I'm going to build bigger barns." And the second those barns were built, the man died and God called him a fool. But we should be clear, the problem is not wealth itself. Money is a tool, and the moral value of a tool is all about how you use it. So Jesus is not condemning wealth itself, but he is providing a very strong warning to the wealthy that if they're not careful, their wealth is going to drive them to do things that are not holy. Their wealth is a temptation that they have to guard against very powerfully. Specifically, I would highlight two temptations that come from our readings today. The first of those temptations is complacency. Our first reading comes from Amos. Amos is the first prophet to have written anything down. We have Elijah and Elisha, but Amos is the first one to have a written book. And he's preaching in northern Israel, and he's preaching a lot about economic disparities and the fact that the people of the time aren't worshiping God, they're not listening to the law, and they're trampling on the poor. So he specifically says, "Woe to the complacent in Zion." And then he lists a lot of markers of wealth, ivory couches and plenty of food. My favorite is they improvise to music. Like, you do need a lot of leisure time to understand music well enough to improvise to it, right? It's a sign of affluence that you have that skill. He says, "Woe to the complacent in Zion." And then at the end he says, "Yet they are not made ill by the collapse of Joseph." Okay, again, nothing inherently wrong with wealth. But the first temptation is to allow wealth to isolate us from the problems of the world. Joseph, in this case, Joseph stands in for the nation of Israel. Joseph is collapsing. The nation of Israel is collapsing. It's collapsing morally. It's collapsing economically. It's collapsing in its military. There are all kinds of reasons why Israel was not doing well at this time. And yet, Amos is saying, the rich don't even notice. They have all this leisure time. They're doing just fine. Everybody's great. They don't notice the collapse happening around them. And that is a temptation. Wealth allows us to say, okay, everybody else's problem is everybody else's problem. I don't have to worry about it. I've got the resources to avoid those problems, so it's not really a concern of mine. The second temptation comes from our gospel, slightly less obvious, but I would call it the temptation to consumerism. Money is power. And again, that's not a problem. It's a tool, and tools need to be used in an appropriate way. But money is power. And you see this, like, for example, we're trying to put a high school across the street, and I worry a little bit about the community meeting because Sacred Heart is located in a very wealthy neighborhood, and sometimes people in a wealthy neighborhood don't like change, and they have connections on the city council, and I'm like, I have to navigate those relationships, right? Okay. Wealth is power. So the temptation for wealth is to say, my power, my resources, my wealth, it's all oriented toward me. It only exists to serve me. You could call it selfishness if you want to. But you see it in the gospel because the rich man, who never notices Lazarus, never notices him once, never pays attention to him. And the gospel isn't saying, by the way, the rich man needed to solve all of Lazarus' problems. It said Lazarus would have been happy with the food that fell off of the guy's table. Like, that would have been enough. So the rich man spends his entire life never noticing or paying any heed to Lazarus. And then he gets to the place of the dead. Note, this is not hell and heaven as we know them today. because Jesus went to hell to preach to the dead, to give them the opportunity for repentance. People who died before Jesus came couldn't get into heaven, but they were given the opportunity to later. So this is sort of a temporary state of the dead that occurred before Jesus came. And it is divided, right? Like Abraham says, those who struggled in life receive comfort. Those who had all of the comfort they needed, they now have to struggle a little bit. The rich man looks at Lazarus next to Abraham and says, "Father Abraham, send Lazarus to give me some water." What incredible arrogance. This guy spent his entire life ignoring Lazarus. And then he's in this place of torment. He sees Lazarus and he's like, yeah, that guy, right? Make him do it. Make him do the work. Because the rich man had gotten into this way of thinking that, okay, I'm rich, I have resources, I have the power, and so everybody else exists to serve my needs. Not just my wealth, but all of the people exist to serve my needs. Lazarus exists to serve my needs. And he doubles down, because when the water's not possible, he's like, well, send Lazarus to my brothers. He didn't ask that he would be sent to his brothers. He didn't ask that Abraham would go to his brothers. Send Lazarus. Again, the temptation of wealth is to say, everything exists for me, and I'm going to use what I have for me. Okay. How do we fight these temptations? Well, when it comes to consumerism, like the selfishness that expresses itself in consumerism, I'm just consuming and taking, the antidote is to give. We want to get into a habit of giving away our resources. Monetary, absolutely. But I would include any resource here. If you have a different kind of power, use that power for the good of others. If you have recently retired and you have extra time on your hands, use that time for the good of others. Don't get into a habit of thinking, all of the wonderful things that God has given me are only for me. Think instead, all of the wonderful things God has given me is for others. We'll talk about this more when we do the official stewardship talk in 2 or 3 weeks. But when it comes to money, I strongly recommend having a commitment, saying this is how much I'm going to give away this year. Because then it's not I give away when I feel like it, it's I've made a commitment. And I would say the same thing with time. If you've never thought about what to give away or how to give away to undermine the temptation for resources, I would recommend starting with 1 hour a week. 1 hour of labor, which is to say, ask yourself, what is my hourly rate if your employer gives you that? How much money do I make per hour? Give that much money away every week. And then 1 hour of time. What would it look like? And you can bank your time. Maybe it's 4 hours on a Saturday once a month. But what would it look like to do 1 hour of volunteering each week? Give your time and your money away, and you will not be tempted to use them only for yourself. You will not be tempted toward the selfishness that the rich man shows in the gospel. Now, if we want to fight the complacencies that we talk about, it is similar and related, but I would take a different approach to it. The problem with complacency, with the isolation that comes, the ability to say, everybody else's problems are not my problems, you can fight that by making other people's problems your problems. Not in like a triangulation drama way, but by trying to enter into their problems. So, for example, we have a lot of economically poor people, and we have people who enter into that experience by being part of ministries that serve the economically poor, who volunteer at Hope House or sometimes at Lighthouse Mission. We are exposing ourselves voluntarily to the struggles of other people. That fights the complacency and the isolation. I would say today, economic poverty continues to be a problem, but we also have a lot of existential poverty. We have a lot of people who are deeply struggling because they don't know Jesus. There is a way to enter into their problems too, to not isolate ourselves, to say, you know what, this person, their kids are just like in a really tough space. I'm going to sit and I'm going to listen to that person and their struggles for a while. I'm just going to let myself hear and be a sounding board. Or, God forbid, but suicide is a huge epidemic in our society. Somebody loses a family member to suicide. our temptation is to run from that. It's really uncomfortable. I don't want to talk to them about that. That's really weird. I don't know what I would say. I don't have anything to offer. You just show up and you sit with them and you see what that looks like. You let other people's problems touch you. You don't isolate yourself from them. And I would say you can see how well you're doing by how uncomfortable you are. Right? The problem with the Israelites in the reading from Amos is, I don't have to deal with it. I am comfortable and luxurious and whatever else. Again, there's nothing wrong with leisure and there's nothing wrong with wealth if used appropriately. But have I gone out of my comfort zone this month in the ways I've talked about getting your hands dirty? But if you don't have that opportunity right away, fast. Give up some food. You have enough money to eat whenever you want, but don't. Voluntarily don't. And then take that suffering and offer it up for somebody else who is suffering. Or, if you're asking, well, what is an appropriate level of tithing? Give enough money that you start saying, well, maybe I can't have everything I want this year. Maybe I can only have 95%, but that 5%, there's a lot of grace in that 5%. Not having everything you want immediately when you want it. Push yourself to the level of discomfort, and then you can say, now I've made other people's problems my own problems. I've not isolated myself from the sufferings of others. Again, wealth, resources, power, time, these are tools. There is nothing inherently immoral about them. The reason Jesus is so strong with the wealthy is because the temptations of wealth are themselves so strong. And Jesus has to push hard that the wealthy do not allow themselves to fall into vice, but they stay centered in Jesus and they act morally. My friends, fight consumerism. Fight complacency by giving away the resources that you have for others, by allowing other people's problems to touch you in some way. And I promise, if you do that, you are going to see the grace of Christ abound.